Hello. Today at Walmart, one of my customers invited me to go to Smokehouse Grill to hear a Civil War lecture tomorrow, and I can't go because I have to work. But I got a newsletter from the Madison County Civil War Roundtable. And it's got an interesting letter here that I was going to read to you. So, without further ado, I'm just going to get started here. Blood and Smoke, Lincoln's Letter to Kentuckian Albert Hodges by Dr. Marshall Myers. On April 4th, 1864, Albert Hodges, a Frankfort, Kentucky newspaper editor, received an answer to a public letter he wrote to Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States. There are various ways to interpret the letter. Below is just one way. All ways to interpret are significant. In reply to the editor's questions, Lincoln spoke quite frankly about his long-held views of slavery and his thinking about Kentucky. The president suspected that he was not very popular in the Commonwealth for his views on slavery. In fact, in 1860, Lincoln, a Kentuckian by birth, had gotten less than 1% of the votes in Kentucky, only 1,364 votes statewide, because Kentucky citizens suspected that the presidential candidate was a dreaded abolitionist bent on destroying slavery in the state. Lincoln knew that this letter would be rewarded by not just the editor, but also others. The readers would be a tough audience. Lincoln had to think of a way to be persuasive but still tell the truth. Unfortunately, many people see politicians as misleading. Many Kentuckians, he was aware, held the belief that if Kentucky sided with the Union after the war, she could keep slavery. In essence, the Commonwealth bet that the Confederacy would lose the Civil War and Kentucky would keep its slaves as a kind of reward for supporting the administration. The promise seemed so logical and believable. That promise was probably not made by anyone, but it persisted in the minds of many Kentuckians. Lincoln never even mentioned it, convinced that mention of it would distract from his message to Kentuckians. Rather than pay attention to a rumor, Lincoln wanted the citizens of Kentucky to know just what his administration planned for the Commonwealth and how the administration regarded the state. Disturbing moves were the assignment of men, like the assignment of military governors like General Stephen Burbridge and General John Palmer, who had spread discontent and anger in the state rather than unity. That was a picture of Albert Beauregard Hodges. Instead, Lincoln listed those actions that showed he had in the past which gave Kentucky a special status. Lincoln avoided then talking about slavery, promises made or not made, and turned the Kentucky citizens' attention to things he had done, a trick any politician would likely do. He thought that he could make his point. He hoped by steering his audience and concentrate on the overall consideration of what he had done or planned to do in the Commonwealth. Lincoln's stance seemed to be that his support for certain measures outweighed his stand on slavery. Lincoln hoped that the audience will discern the big picture of what he had done and give attention to what Lincoln had done for Kentucky. For example, Kentucky early in the war was treated as though she indeed had special status, trading, for example, with both the North and the South. Kentucky, too, was exempt from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The decree meant that slavery was legal in Kentucky. Consequently, a slave owner in Kentucky could fight for the North, support the Constitution, own slaves, and still be loyal to the federal government. Lincoln then began to pile on the evidence of his support of the state and listed other things and listed what done which impacted state. Lincoln was saying to the audience, pay attention to what all I have done for the state. As a politician, Lincoln sensed that to divert attention away from slavery onto his plans for the Commonwealth. Lincoln's other moves. True, the actions Lincoln described in the letter surely had meaning for more than just Kentucky. The letter is a clear statement of what Lincoln thought about slavery. In that way, Lincoln was not just articulating his stance on slavery clear. Lincoln as saying that there were other matters too. Keep your eye on the big picture. The Lincoln letter was important to every Kentuckian also because it not only showed how the president felt about slavery and what he hoped the voters would infer from his words what he was likely to do. Lincoln explained himself. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I didn't so feel. That clarified any misconceptions about his stand against slavery for Commonwealth citizens. Entirely clear what Lincoln's stand was. Lincoln made his point, but he wanted to move on to other things he had done with the state in mind and invite the readers to see what else he had done to forget. He hoped and leave behind slavery as a dissenting topic. Lincoln was willing to admit that slavery was a topic that Lincoln and his readers disagreed on, but the readers would pay attention to what all he had done for the state. I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution to the best of my ability was a sacred agreement, that he, as president, could not breach. Despite his personal feelings about slavery, he hoped that the question of slavery would be a distraction from his message, not a point which would cause the readers to ignore the rest and ignore what he wanted his readers to focus on, just that one point. Thus, to clinch his argument, Lincoln stayed away from the subject of slavery as a topic adaptable and reminded the state's citizens of the many other things he did or didn't do to or for the state. In other words, he wanted to show what he had done with the slavery issue at the national level. For example, when General John Fremont freed all the slaves in Missouri, Lincoln could not let that order be the law in Missouri. In other words, even though he agreed with the Fremont, even though he agreed with what Fremont had done, after all, Lincoln appeared to have his hands tied by what the Constitution allowed him to do. Lincoln seemed to be saying that Kentuckians had no reason to fear what the president would do. After all, he was harmless since he had sworn allegiance to the Constitution. To prove his point, Lincoln also reached out and met with the Kentucky congressional delegation on 3 separate occasions to offer compensation emancipation to the border states. His offer was rebuffed. This action included money for the slaves, but it was flat turned down. Lincoln accepted their decision and offered all that he could to deal with the slavery issue. All these measures showed that Lincoln was thinking of the Commonwealth and the implications of its choices. Lincoln said that he was quite serious about not only interpreting the Constitution while being sensitive to the politics of the border states. Lincoln then appeared to be serious about working with Commonwealth, hoping his audience would jump to the conclusion that he wasn't going to bother slavery at all. Yet freeing the slaves just in the Confederacy was not all what Lincoln wanted to do nationwide. He would have freed all the slaves everywhere, but he wanted Kentucky to know what his intent was and hoped that the state would believe that was all he would do. After all, his hands were tied. Lincoln had one more bombshell that he thought he had prepared his readers for. Significantly, Lincoln had one more measure to propose. He said that the time had come only recently to use colored forces. Men were needed on the battlefield. Lincoln believed he was driven to the alternative of surrendering the Union. The use of black soldiers meant lower recruitment figures for white soldiers from Kentucky, and these colored soldiers would be stationed out of the purview of Kentucky anyway. He hoped that they would buy his arguments. Using black soldiers turned out to be the correct decision. The enrollment of black soldiers shows a gain of 130,000 soldiers, seamen, and laborers. In other words, the time to use colored soldiers was now, and his arguments were such that most Kentuckians could live with, especially the arguments that not as many white Kentuckians would have to serve. He then issued the Emancipation Proclamation purely for wartime use. He didn't intend it to be permanent. Lincoln hoped that his readers would buy into that conclusion and forget about slavery. In conclusion, the letter has all the earmarks of a highly political statement designed to placate a hostile audience. Lincoln often talked about pleasing the audience with his writing, or rather, is the letter a general survey of how Kentucky would fare in the future, and that's all? That is, the letter is nothing but a president relating to his audience, where a particular state is going and what he as president has done for that state. Perhaps, though, the letter is an astute politician telling an awkward state in the Union what he is going to do. In other words, it relates just what the president is going to do and what to expect, and doesn't care whether the citizens of that state think. I got a picture here of the Chenault Brigade Reunion Group. So that was a pretty good read, and I enjoyed reading it to you. You know, I got to learn a lot about Abraham Lincoln. Even at 40 years old, I didn't know that what a good politician he was. And, you know, who knows what would have happened had he not been assassinated, because things certainly may have turned out differently. Well, I hope you all have a good evening. I hope you enjoyed our little talk about the Civil War, and keep looking for stuff that piques your interest. Well, have a good day. Bye.